Hello and welcome to episode 7 of Bicep for Real. So, this week we're continuing on with our journey of developing our ARM templates for this real life project, and we're going to have a look today at API management. Now, as with all our other sessions, even if you're not looking to implement API management in your own project, there's a lot of examples and learning material in this that will be relevant regardless of what you're doing. Things we're going to look at, particularly around importing files, working with resources that need to be created before others, and so on. All of this is going to be relevant to whatever you're deploying. So as previously, we're continuing with our Lambda Toys digital store project. We're looking to deploy the resources that are going to run their new API. This is our design. And if you remember this, we've got a lot of this done now. We've got all of our databases, our key vaults, containers, container registries, all that sort of stuff deployed. So the bit we're missing now is the API management piece that's going to sit in front of our application and provide some of the required application security. So we're going to have a look at deploying that today. And let's get into that and have a look at the ARM template for doing that. Okay, so here we are back in our project. We've got all the files from last time. And we're going to go ahead and start working on the APIM. So we're going to create a new Bicep file. So we're going to continue with our work of compartmentalizing the pieces so that we can run them independently if we want to, but we can also call them all together as part of our main template. So let's go ahead and create that. Called APIM.bicep. Okay, now what we will do is we'll go in and think about what resource. So we're going to need these location and prefix parameters as well. Sorry, wrong one. So we'll stick those in. And then we'll see what else we need as we start building this out. So the first thing we're going to need to deploy is the API management instance. So I believe there's one of these in the snippet. Yep. Okay. Okay, so that's going to deploy the API management instance. We do need to do is change the version. For some reason the snippet's using the older version, so we're just going to up that to the latest version. Okay. Then for the name, again, we're going to use our same naming convention with the prefix and adding APIM this time to the end. We've got our location. Now, on the SKU piece, so if you remember from our requirements a while back, one of the things we need to look at this was cost. And so what we're going to actually do is we're going to use the consumption tier of APIM, which will allow us to just pay for APIM when it's being used. Now, this should work fine for our development environment. And it may work fine for our test and even production environments, but we need to do some testing. So one of the things we're going to do is parameterize this to make sure that if we find that the consumption tier isn't the right option for production, we can change that. So let's add some parameters, and we'll add a tier parameter, and we'll set that by default to consumption, but you can override it. And we also need to set a capacity value, that's an integer, and we'll set it to 0. 0 is what is needed for the consumption tier to work. So we'll just go ahead and override these options here so that we can override them if we need to. We are not going to join it to a virtual network. The consumption tier doesn't support that, but we are going to set some of the properties here. Okay, so that's the basic piece of API management. That will deploy an API management instance, and that will work. There are some other things we're going to look to tweak on this later, but we'll come back to that. So the next thing we're going to look at is deploying the actual API. So the API management instance is just a container. There's nothing on it. There's no APIs configured. So if you try and hit it, it won't do anything. So we need to configure our APIs. And obviously, everybody's API is different. This is where your actual developers would have defined their API specification, and we need to load that in here. Now, there are a couple of ways of doing that with APIM. The first one is you can actually define each individual API as an ARM object. There is a property to do that, and you can define the entire API as ARM, Bicep even, if you want to. That's fairly tedious, particularly if you're not the one developing the API and you're just taking it somewhere else. So the other option is you can import a file. and it supports various different file types, OpenAPI, Swagger, and so on. And so we're going to do that. We're going to import a file that our developers have given us. And so if you have a look in this resources folder we've already got, there is this Lambda Store Swagger API, and this has been provided by our developers. This is a Swagger 2.0 file. You probably nowadays might get an OpenAPI 3 file, but this will work just fine. And this defines all the APIs in a JSON format. That's a standard for API definition. So we've got that. That's been provided to us. And the assumption is if developers come along and want to change the API, they will do a pull request on this file, and we'll go through the process on that. So to actually use that, what we're going to do is we are going to use the API property. So it's already configured. So this is the API. It's using the service/APIs resource, and we're going to give it a name. And this is another case where this needs to link to the parent. So we're going to use this syntax here, which is the name of the API management instance / the name of the API. You could also use the parent property as well if you wanted to. That would work too. And then the interesting bit comes in the properties section. So we first want to tell it what format the file is. And you've got a few options. We need Swagger JSON. We need the value. And this is where we give it the file. And this is where we're going to use one of the functions in Bicep called load text content. So this allows you to basically point it at a file and it will load that in. And this file is in the resources folder. And then I'm just going to copy that to make sure I don't misspell it. Go. That needs to be in quotes. Okay, and that will load the file for us. And then we just need a path, which is the actual path used in the URL. So we'll just call it Lambda Toy Store. Okay, and that will create the actual API for us. And then lastly, we're going to create a product and a product link to link the API to the product. So a product in APIM is just a sort of set of APIs you group together that you can then give somebody access to. So I'll just paste those in, save you watching me type those things. I think I've missed one. So we're actually going to create 3 things here. So the first thing we're going to create is a product. And this is just the thing that, when we have people who come and want to subscribe to the API, they will be given access to a particular product. And this is the toy product they'll be given access to. And you've got some information about, the display name and so on. And then this subscription required field, which is pretty important. This basically means that you need a subscription key to access this. The API isn't open to the internet. You don't need approval. So if somebody has an account, they can access API, and you can only have 1 subscription. So that's the product. Then we're adding a policy. And so this is for the security piece. And in particular, we're adding a rate limiting policy. So this will allow us to ensure that somebody hitting the API can only hit it so many times within a given period. So our rate limit policy here basically says you can have 5 requests to the API within a 60-second limit. And that should keep, prevent somebody doing a denial of service attack against the API. The requests there are fairly low, but that's what we're expecting for this. This is not a high volume API, so we can keep that low. We could tweak that if you wanted. Now, you notice here that this is XML, just basic XML that's been pasted directly into the code. We could do here the same as we did with the API itself, and again, do a file reference. If you had some more complex policies that you want to define in more detail, I'd recommend doing that. Create a file and reference that in the same way. The format here just different, it being XML rather than the Swagger file. The last piece is just the product API link. So this basically says that the Lambda Store API that we created here is going to be a member of this product. Okay, and that is pretty much all we need at this point for our basic setup. So we can go ahead and we can deploy that, and let's go and see what actually gets deployed. Okay, so we've got our command line here. Now we're going to go ahead and run this deployment. Nothing special here, same command, just changing the files to use the apim.bicep and dev apim properties file, and we'll go ahead and run that to deploy the APIM. So this deployment did actually fail, and it's down to this error we've got here around the API not found. Unfortunately, this is down to a dependency issue. So we created in our code, we've got the API, and then we've got the link of the API to the product, and there's no dependency between those two. So they tried to run the link before the API was created, and it failed. So if we go back to VS Code, you see here, we've amended the toy product API link here to add a dependency section. This depends on option here to allow that dependency to be created. Originally, I did try actually changing the name here to use the name of the API directly, so it would create the implicit dependency. For some reason, that doesn't work, gives you an issue about the length of the segments in the name. I'll look into why that doesn't work in the future, but for now, this is a quick and easy one that'll resolve that problem for us. Over in the portal, you see we've got our API management instance that has been correctly deployed. If we go have a look in the APIs piece, you can see we've got our Lambda Store API that's been created with all the operations we requested in that Swagger file. And if we have a look in products, we've also got the toy product, and it's all set up, and it's got the Lambda Store API attached to it, and it's got that policy with the rate limiting that we added with the 5 calls per 60-second period. So that's all worked as expected. Okay, so that deployed our basic API, and that worked. But one of the things you will notice is the fact that if we want to hit that, we have to go to a Microsoft published URL that has the Microsoft API management name in it. We obviously don't want that for our API. We want to send them to a lambatoys.com link. So what we need to do is add a custom host name to the API management instance. And this is a bit of a pain. And so we're going to run through how this works, and you can see how I'll put that together. And this will also help you with any of these sort of things where you've got sort of circular dependency type things on a resource. Okay. So the settings for a custom hostname are done in the hostname configuration section. And you can have multiple of those, so it's an array. And there's a few things we want to set in here. So the first obviously is the hostname. What do you want to call the actual hostname? We're going to use our prefix name in again, but use the lambdatoys.com domain. That's fairly straightforward. You also have to set a type. So there are various different bits of the API management that you can actually set custom URLs for. So you can see developer portal and management and so on. What we're interested in is one called proxy, which is actually really the gateway. That's the bit that you present to the customer. So that needs to be set to proxy. Okay, and that's the very basic information. However, if I deploy that now, it's not going to work. It's going to give me some errors, 2 of them in particular. So the first one is it's going to tell me that the host name, this prefix-apim.lambdatoys.com hostname, does not have a DNS record that is pointing to the APIM. Of course it doesn't. I haven't created that. Now, normally you would do this after the fact when you know what that URL is going to be. But unfortunately, because of the way this is designed, you have to have the DNS record pointing to the APIM before you try and give it the host name. So it's a bit of a pain. So we need to resolve that first. We'll come to the second issue in a minute, but let's deal with the first one. So we need to create a DNS record for this APIM in the lambdatoys.com domain. Now, as you can imagine, the lambdatoys.com domain is an Azure DNS zone, which makes our lives significantly easier, but it's not in the resource group that's been deployed by our ARM template, because this is a centrally managed resource. We use this for lots of other things that the lambdatoys.com domain. So it's in a different resource group, and so that means we can't just create the record in this top level ARM template, because it will complain that the scope of that resource is not within this resource group. So what we have to do is we did last week when we looked at this main template and we called into sub resources or separate files. We're going to have to do the same thing here so that we can change the scope. So we're going to create a file, and we'll call it external resources Bicep. So we're going to use this for more than just DNS, but this is for where we need to access resources that are in a different resource group. And in particular, we have a core resource group that's separate to this, that contains all of our resources that are shared between multiple projects. Okay, so what we need to do is, firstly, we need to get a reference. Firstly, we need to get a reference to the DNS zone that we want to write the record to. So that already exists. So we're going to use the existing resource and we're going to point it at the DNS zone. Now you see the zone name there we haven't got yet. So we're going to need a parameter for the zone name. So we'll stick that in there. Next, we need to create a DNS record in that zone for our APIM. And so there's a couple of parameters we're going to need to pass in as well. I'll just set them up and I'll tell you what they are. So the first one here, the record name, is the actual record that we want to create in the zone. So what is the URL that's going to be created in the lambdatoys.com domain? So the prefix -apim bit, basically. And then the CNAME is the URL of the existing APIM URL, the Microsoft one, that we want that to point to. Okay. And that will go ahead and create that DNS record for us. So the next piece we have to do is to actually pull that. Okay, so if we go back to save that, and we'll go back to our APIM resource, and we need to do that before we create the APIM instance so that it exists before we do that. So we'll call that APIM external resources. And we want to call this. Okay, and again, we will use this. Oops. For the name doesn't really matter here. Now the scope needs to be the resource group that we want to deploy to. So again, we want to make sure we can customize this because we'll probably might have a different resource group for production versus dev. So we're going to add a parameter for that, and we will go ahead and set that up. Now you can see that's complaining because that's not a scope, that's just a string. So what we need to do is use the resource group function here, which will turn that into a resource group object that can then be used. And then the next bit, we need to actually set the parameters. And so we need to set here the zone name. I'll code that one. Next, we need the record name. And so we know that's going to be this. We're going to use the same, basically the name we use for the resource. So that'll get appended to the domain name. So you'll get prefix-apim.lambdatoys.com. That's great. And then the CNAME is the name of the API management instance that we're going to create. Now, as I mentioned, this hasn't been created yet. So we're going to have to rely on naming convention to figure this one out. So we know the name we're passing in here for the API management resource group is prefix-apim. And what that will translate to into is that name.azureapi.net. Fortunately, the approach is static so that we know what that will turn into. If we didn't know and the name was randomly generated, like some resources, we are going to be a bit stuck. At that point, we'd probably have to do something with running a deployment script or something after the APIM is created to go and set up the external resource, the host name, which would be a right pain. But fortunately, this is static, so we can do that. So that will work. That will go ahead and create our DNS name. That solves that problem. Unfortunately, we will still have another issue because it will then complain it doesn't have an SSL certificate to be able to support that. So we need to create that as well. Now, there is a managed resource certificate, so you can have Azure create that for you. Unfortunately, it doesn't work with the Bicep template. What that does, if you ever use the managed resource certificate, it has to obviously prove that you own the domain that you're creating the certificate for. And the way that APIM does that is with asking you to create a DNS text record for the resource with a specific value, so it can confirm that you own the domain. Unfortunately, it complains if you create the resource without that existing, but you don't know what that's going to be until it's created, the value. So you can't actually use that, at least as far as I've been able to figure out so far. Maybe there is a way to make it work using separate sub resources or something. I haven't figured it out yet. But for the time being, what we've got, I've got a wildcard certificate that's stored in a separate key vault that again is in that core external resource group. And so again, we're going to need to use our external resources template to actually be able to get hold of that. So if we hop back to our external resources, and we are going to do 3 things in here. So firstly, we've got an existing key vault, so we need to create a reference to that key vault, and we need to know the name of the key vault. So we'll just add that as a parameter as well. Go. That will get us a link to the key vault. Now, the second piece is that we need to grant the API management instance access to read that key vault. Otherwise, it's going to complain. So this role IDs array is the 2 roles that are needed to be able to access the certificate and use it. This is on a key vault that's set up with RBAC access rather than the older access method, and I'd recommend you use that from going forward. So that's going to this is just an array of resources to use, and then we've got a role assignment here where we're going to create that assignment on the resource for the APIM. Now, the APIM needs to use managed identity to access this. Again, because at this point the APIM isn't created, we can't use a system assigned managed identity because it doesn't exist. So we need to use a user assigned managed identity. And so we're going to pass that into the template. We'll go and create the managed identity in a minute, but let's just add a parameter. So this is just the ID of the managed identity that we need, and that's going to get passed in here. We're using the GUID function here to generate a GUID for the role assignment name, and we're passing in these 3 values, which means as long as these 3 values are the same, it will generate the same GUID every time. And so make sure that, if we rerun the template, we still get the same name. And the rest of it is just scoping it to the particular resource ID, the role ID, and then the principal ID of the actual managed identity and the fact that it's a service principal. We are also using a for loop here. So I'm not sure if we've covered these yet, but we want to loop through this role IDs array to add a role for each of these required role IDs. So to do that, all you do is you take your existing assignment, and let's remove that for the moment so you can see how this works. Okay, so the minute this is a single role assignment that gets applied once, we want to loop through this array. So to do that, what we need to do is we create a for loop, firstly starting with square brackets at either end, there, and then we just do for the name of the variable you want to create for each instance, and then in, and the array or whatever it is you're looping over, and then a colon. And so that will tell it to basically loop over this array, and for each one, put the value into role ID and then create the resource. So we'll end up with 2 of those. We could come back in here and we could add a third option, and it would then work. It would create that for us. Okay, so that's our external resource setup. We've now got some work to do back over on the APIM piece. So first up, we need to actually create a managed identity. We've done this before, I think, but this is just using the user assigned identities option. We need to give it a name, which we've done here, and a location. There's nothing terribly complicated about managed identities, creating them anyway. In our external resources, we've got some properties to send in. So the managed identity one we can do is just the APIM user identity, and what you actually need here is the principal ID rather than the resource ID. So this is the Azure AD identity, not the Azure one. Pass that in. And then we also need the key vault name. And that we're going to pass in as a parameter to the template so that we can vary that depending on the environment. And so we'll put that in there. So that's our external resource bit done. The last bit we need to figure out is we actually need to assign the identity to the APIM. So there is an identity section we're going to add in here, and we need some types, and so we're going to set that up as user assigned. That's what we've got. If you also wanted to be able to use a system assigned at the same time, you can do both, or you can do it like that if you want to. But we just need the user assigned one, and then we need to give it the identities. And this syntax on this is a bit weird. So you've basically got multiple identities, but the syntax you use is this. So we want to give it the APIM user identity property and then the ID, and this is the actual Azure ID at this point. That's fairly straightforward, but for some reason you then have to finish up the syntax so that it looks like that. I'm not entirely sure what that's about, but that will work, and that will assign the identity to the key vault. Sorry, to the API management instance. So now when we deploy that, it will go and create the DNS record we need, the CNAME pointing to the instance for our custom hostname. It will assign that custom hostname to the APIM. It will go and grant, well, first it will create a managed identity. It will assign that managed identity to the API management instance. It will grant that managed identity the rights to go and get the certificate from Key Vault, and then it will assign that certificate to our API management instance so that it can be used with this name. Now, there is one last bit we've missed, which is actually how do we tell it which certificate to use? Because there obviously could be many secrets or certificates in that Key Vault. So we need to set this up in the hostname configuration. So we've got the certificate, that one it's certificate source, which is going to be Key Vault. We've got the Key Vault ID, which again, we are going to pass in as a parameter. So you've got the name of the Key Vault, but actually we need the full ID as well. So let's just add that in here. And then you've got this identity client ID, which is telling it which identity to use to access the Key Vault. So we're going to use that APIM user identity again, and properties. And this time you need the client ID. Various different IDs for this thing get used all over the place, but this one we need the client ID. So that now tells it to go and look in this particular Key Vault, go and grab the certificate at this ID. So this ID here actually isn't an ID, so I'm actually going to change that to URL because that makes more sense. So this is the fully qualified URL to the secret that contains your certificate. So we will go and grab that from our Key Vault and we'll pass that in, and that will tell it where to look for that. I'll show you that in a second. Okay, so that's ready to go. We're going to want to test it out, obviously. Eventually, we're going to add it into our main Bicep, but for now, we're going to create a new JSON file to allow us to test this on its own. And I've got a few things in here. We also need to add a couple more things in. So we'll quickly grab the values for those. So we've got the standard ones, our location and our prefix that we said before. The Key Vault name, that's just the actual name of the vault that we're going to use. The resource group that contains our external resources. And then the Key Vault URL. As I mentioned, this is the fully qualified URL that you can get from Key Vault. If you go click on the secret, it will give you this URL to a particular certificate. Now, I've set this to the top level one, so we'll get the latest version. You can, if you want a specific version, also add the ID of the secret in the end there, but I'm just going to get the top level one. That will tell it what secret to go and grab. So we're going to go ahead and run our deployment again. Same kind as last time. but now we've got the extra pieces in to do our hostname piece. So let's run that, see if that works. Okay, so the first one of that did fail for a similar reason to what we saw in the previous deployment. So there is a dependency issue where it was running the API management update before the external resources have been run. So we've just added a depends on section in here to make sure there is an explicit dependency between those two. And once we were able to run that through, that all went fine. And so if we hop back to our API management instance, and we'll just refresh that. Firstly, you can see it's created the managed identity for us. We'll go have a look in here, and you can see the host name has changed over to the lambdatoys.com one. If we go have a look in, where is it? The custom domains, you can see we've got our lambdatoys one, and you can see it's configured it to grab the certificate from keyboard. So that has all worked successfully, and we've got our API management instance deployed. The only thing we now need to do, the last part, is if we go back to our VS Code instance, we're going to want to update our main Bicep file to add in the API management instance. So we'll go ahead and create that, apim.bicep. Give it a name of APIM. We're also going to add a dependency here, and for the minute we should just need the core piece run, I think. And then for the parameters, we can steal these two directly. What else have we got? So pretty much all of these we're going to want to pass on through. So if we come back in here and we'll just grab these. And we will add those there. And we'll just pass those on through to the underlying resource. Go. So also, while we're doing that, then we're going to want to copy those into our top level parameter file that we use for testing now. So there we go. That's now ready to go. So we'll be able to deploy that either individually or from our top level template, and that should get those resources deployed. That's all for today. I hope you found that useful. As I said, you can apply these methods to pretty much any resource, things like file imports, dealing with resources that are outside the scope of your resource group. All of that's applicable across pretty much any resource. We're now at a point where we've actually got all of the resources that we need for our application defined in our ARM template. We can deploy all those resources. So now we're going to look at taking this up to the next level in next week's session, where we're going to look at building out some automation to actually deploy the resources. So we'll start looking at pipelines and how we can configure them to deploy the resources, and also then start moving through different stages, so dev, test, prod, and those sort of things. So we'll pick that up next time. Hopefully I'll see you then. Until then, have a great rest of your day.